People say this company owns the world because it shows up everywhere. It's in retirement accounts, in index funds, in pensions, in the bland background of finance where nobody pays attention. The phrase feels satisfying because it turns an invisible system into a single villain you can point at. But what if the real story isn't ownership at all, and the word owns is the first lie we tell ourselves to make the picture simple? Because owning a thing is easy to imagine. You picture a deed, a title, a hand on the steering wheel. You picture a boardroom, a cigar, a decision that changes your life. And then you hear that one asset manager has trillions, and your brain does the shortcut math. Trillions must mean control, and control must mean power, and power must mean the world. Except the modern economy doesn't work like a heist movie. Power isn't always a hand on the wheel. Sometimes it's the map everyone uses, the lane markers nobody questions, the autopilot that keeps the car centered even when nobody knows who installed it. If you want to understand why this company feels so big, you have to stop asking who it owns. You have to ask what it organizes. And the uncomfortable part is that it organizes ordinary money. Not secret money. Not exotic money. It organizes the money of teachers and firefighters, the money of people who never read a shareholder letter, the money of institutions that can't afford to be wrong. When you bundle that kind of money together, you don't need to own the world to shape it. You just need to become the default route the money takes. That's the first twist people miss. The company at the center of this story doesn't need to win elections, start wars, or draft laws. It only needs to sit where the money passes through, quietly charging a toll for efficiency. It doesn't have to persuade you. It only has to be useful. So when you hear they own everything, don't picture a king. Picture plumbing. Picture the pipes under a city, the valves, the pressure gauges, the control room that doesn't create water but decides where it flows. In that world, the most powerful entity isn't the one that drinks the water. It's the one that designed the distribution. The modern investment industry sells a comforting idea: markets are wild, but they're also fair if you diversify. You can't pick winners, so you buy the whole field. You don't need genius, you need exposure. The promise is democratic in tone, even if it's built on corporate mechanics. And once that promise is accepted, scale becomes the prize. Scale is not just bigger. Scale is cheaper, faster, harder to replace. Scale lets you offer a fund with a tiny fee and still make money because you're running the system for millions of people at once. Scale turns an investment product into infrastructure. And once you become infrastructure, the question changes from "do we like this?" to "what happens if we lose it?" That shift is where the myth begins. The company doesn't own the world like a monarch. It sits in the middle like a platform, a set of products and tools that other institutions plug into because doing it alone costs more. The world doesn't belong to it. The world routes itself through it. Now step back to the pressure that created the opening. For decades, big pools of money had the same problem: they had obligations they couldn't dodge. Retirement promises, insurance liabilities, endowments, public budgets. They needed steady returns, and they needed them with a kind of reliability the stock market doesn't naturally offer. They also needed something else: cover. Cover means a story you can tell when things go wrong. If you pick stocks and lose, you look incompetent. If you buy the market and lose, you can say the market lost. If you follow a widely accepted strategy, your mistake becomes a shared mistake, and shared mistakes don't end careers the same way. Institutions don't just buy returns. They buy plausible explanations. That's why passive investing didn't just grow because it was cheaper. It grew because it gave decision makers a shield. Indexing says, we are not trying to outsmart anyone. It says, we are taking what the market gives. That sounds humble, but it is also a powerful way to avoid blame, and blame avoidance is a hidden engine in financial history. At the same time, regulation and public scrutiny pushed investors toward transparency. Complex bets became harder to defend. Conflicts of interest became harder to hide. The market began to reward simplicity, at least on the surface. The simplest pitch in finance is still the strongest: buy everything. So the company expanded by solving institutional discomfort. It offered broad exposure, risk tools, reporting, compliance-friendly structures, and the promise of efficiency. It didn't need to convince the public directly at first. It needed to convince gatekeepers, the people who sign the mandates and the consultants who advise them. And gatekeepers love predictable processes more than they love daring ideas. Then technology tightened the loop. Finance used to be built around human judgment with spreadsheets and phone calls. Over time it became built around models, systems, dashboards, and a shared language of risk. The more money you manage, the more you need to translate messy reality into clean metrics. If you can sell not just funds but a way of seeing the market, you become harder to remove. That's where the story becomes less about products and more about operating systems. When an institution uses the same platform to measure risk, run scenarios, manage portfolios, and report exposures, it starts to think in that platform's categories. What gets measured becomes what matters. What doesn't fit neatly into the system becomes invisible or inconvenient. The company's influence, then, isn't only the shares it holds. It's the frameworks it provides. When enough institutions adopt the same tools, their behavior begins to synchronize even if nobody coordinates it. They respond to similar signals, rebalance on similar schedules, and interpret volatility through similar dashboards. It can look like conspiracy from the outside, but it can also be something more boring and more dangerous: alignment through convenience. There's another pressure that rarely gets discussed. In a global economy, governments and central banks need markets to function, especially in a crisis. They need liquidity, pricing, and confidence. When panic hits, they don't have time to build new pipes. They use the pipes that already exist. That reliance creates strange partnerships. Not secret partnerships, but practical ones. If a public institution needs to stabilize a market, it will lean on firms that already have the scale, the data, and the operational ability to execute quickly. The firm becomes a contractor for the system itself. And once you've played that role, the perception of power grows, whether or not the firm actually commands anything. Now add the psychology of ownership. When an asset manager buys shares, it often buys them on behalf of clients. The underlying money belongs to pensioners, retirees, savers. The firm is an agent. It votes proxies, it engages with management, it sets policies for how it will use those votes. That looks like control, but it's a particular kind of control without direct economic ownership, and accountability that is diffused across layers. This is where the public narrative gets trapped. People hear largest shareholder and assume a single mind is steering corporations. But shareholding through funds is a bundle of small claims aggregated by a manager. The manager has influence, yes, but it also has constraints. It must track an index. It must follow mandates. It must avoid scandal. Its power is real, but it is shaped by a business model that depends on trust and routine. So if you're looking for a villain who wakes up and decides the fate of a company, you'll be disappointed. The more interesting question is colder. What happens when influence becomes a byproduct of being the default? What happens when the system creates a giant because everyone is trying to be safe? The point where the meaning flips is not when the firm gets big. It's when bigness stops being a strategy and starts being a condition. At that point, the firm becomes a kind of market utility. It can't easily take radical positions because radical positions would threaten its role as neutral infrastructure. Yet its neutrality still has shape. Because neutrality is not emptiness. Neutrality is a set of rules. It's a policy about how to vote, how to engage, how to define risk, how to interpret long-term value. Even deciding to follow the market embeds assumptions about which companies count, which countries are investable, which industries are standard. The index is not nature. The index is a decision. And once you accept that, the claim owns the world starts to look childish. The firm doesn't need to own. It needs to standardize. It needs to set templates for what responsible investing looks like, what risk looks like, what long-term looks like. Then it can insist it's merely reflecting reality while quietly helping to define it. There's a specific tension here that most coverage misses. This firm is expected to be both passive and active at the same time. Passive in portfolio construction, because it tracks indexes and offers broad funds. Active in governance, because the shares it holds come with votes, and the public increasingly expects large holders to act like stewards. Those two roles pull against each other, and the compromise is where influence hides. If it stays truly passive in governance, it gets accused of neglect. If it becomes too active, it gets accused of imposing ideology or overstepping. Either way, its size makes it a lightning rod. And when a company becomes a lightning rod, it learns to speak in carefully engineered language: duty, risk management, long-term value, client interests. These phrases are not lies, but they are shields. The deeper pivot is that this firm's power is as much about what it cannot do as what it can. It cannot easily dump a company if that company is in the index, because tracking error costs clients and damages the product's credibility. It cannot easily concentrate bets without breaking the passive promise. It cannot easily take a political stance without provoking regulators and customers. Its dominance forces it into the role of cautious manager of a machine that must keep running. So what does it do instead? It builds influence through process. It pushes standardization, disclosure, and risk frameworks that make the market more legible and, not coincidentally, easier to manage at scale. It encourages corporate behavior that reduces volatility and uncertainty, because uncertainty is expensive for a system that manages trillions. This isn't a secret plot. It's an economic preference disguised as a moral posture. Here's the part that should make you pause. When a system becomes large enough, it starts to treat stability as a product. Not national stability. Market stability. The smooth functioning of capital flows. That can be good, until stability becomes a reason to protect incumbents and punish disruptions. Then risk management begins to sound like keep the existing order. But even that isn't a simple accusation. Disruption can be fraud, it can be innovation, it can be political upheaval, it can be genuine competition. A massive allocator of capital has to decide which kind it is, often quickly, often based on imperfect data. When it chooses caution, it can slow change. When it chooses to chase trends, it can inflate bubbles. Either way, its size means its behavior echoes. And that echo creates a strange feedback loop. Companies optimize for what big holders want, because big holders set the tone for shareholder expectations. Big holders optimize for what clients want, because clients are chasing performance and low fees. Clients optimize for what feels safe, because nobody wants to be the person who deviated and got punished. The loop is not controlled by a single mastermind. It is controlled by incentives that point in the same direction. So the owns the world line misses the real discomfort. The discomfort is that modern capitalism built a system where the rational move for millions of people creates a concentrated center of gravity. Nobody has to conspire. Nobody has to meet in secret. The structure does the work. If you want to find the point of maximum leverage, don't look for a backroom. Look for the interface. Look for the moment when an institution decides what counts as risk, what counts as acceptable exposure, what counts as responsible behavior. Those decisions can be encoded in policy documents, in software settings, in model assumptions. And once encoded, they travel faster than ideology because they travel as best practice. This is why outrage is such a weak lens. Outrage wants a villain with a face. But the most consequential power in finance is often faceless, procedural, and justified as common sense. When you can describe your choices as neutral, you win arguments before they start. When you can call your influence stewardship, you sound like a caretaker rather than a governor. Now move gently toward the present. The world is living through overlapping tensions that push more people toward the very thing they fear. Volatility makes passive exposure attractive because it feels diversified. Complexity makes large platforms attractive because they offer tools and expertise. Political uncertainty makes institutions crave insulation, which often means standard strategies and large providers. The same pressures that produce concentration also make concentration feel necessary. And the public conversation keeps lagging behind the reality. People talk about the company as if it's a single actor. But the system around it matters just as much: index providers, regulators, consultants, retirement plan rules, tax incentives, cultural narratives about what a responsible saver does. A giant firm didn't appear in a vacuum. It appeared as an answer to a question society kept asking: how do we make investing easier, cheaper, and harder to blame? That question doesn't go away. If anything, it becomes louder. More people are pushed into markets through retirement systems. More governments rely on capital markets to finance themselves. More companies live and die by stock prices that reflect flows as much as fundamentals. And more technology compresses decision-making into models that can be copied across institutions in a weekend. So here's the lingering problem. If the firm is not a king, but a set of pipes, who is accountable when the plumbing shapes the city? If everyone is acting rationally inside their role, who is responsible for the outcomes the system produces? When influence is a byproduct, how do you regulate it without breaking the benefits people rely on? The next time you hear, "they own the world," ask a different question. What if the more accurate fear is that nobody owns the world anymore, not in the old sense? What if ownership has been replaced by management, and management has been replaced by metrics, and metrics have been replaced by automated routines that chase stability and scale? And if that's true, the final question isn't whether one company is too big. The question is whether we've built a system that can only function when something is too big. Because if the economy now depends on institutions that must not fail, what does that do to competition, to risk, to democracy, to the idea that markets are supposed to punish mistakes? There's no clean ending here, because clean endings are the luxury of stories with villains. This is a story about convenience, fear, and the search for safety. It's about how a rational society can build an irrational center of gravity. And it leaves you with a quieter suspicion: if the most powerful financial actor is the one that feels least like an actor, how would you even know when it starts to steer?